There was a time when stepping into the octagon against Conor McGregor felt less like entering a fight and more like volunteering to become part of history. It didn't matter how talented the opponent was. It didn't matter how many victories they had accumulated or how many championships they had won. The moment the cage door closed, something strange seemed to happen. Confidence started disappearing. Game plans started falling apart. Fighters who looked unbeatable suddenly became hesitant. And somewhere in the middle of that chaos stood Conor McGregor, calm, relaxed, and somehow completely convinced that he already knew how the story would end. For a brief but unforgettable period in UFC history, he wasn't just winning fights. He was redefining what it meant to be a superstar in combat sports. What made McGregor so fascinating wasn't simply the fact that he knocked people out. Plenty of fighters possess knockout power. Plenty of athletes have explosive speed. Plenty of champions have incredible records. What made Conor different was his ability to make elite fighters look ordinary. He didn't just beat opponents. He made them fight the fight he wanted them to fight. He manipulated reactions, controlled emotions, dictated distance, and slowly pulled opponents into traps they didn't even realize existed. By the time they understood what was happening, the left hand was already on its way. To many casual fans, the explanation seemed simple. They saw the knockouts and concluded that everything revolved around his famous left hand. But the reality was much more complicated. The left hand was merely the final chapter of a story that had already been written through footwork, timing, positioning, feints, psychological warfare, and an almost supernatural understanding of distance. McGregor wasn't simply throwing punches. He was gathering information. Every movement from his opponent became data. Every reaction created another opportunity. Every exchange brought him one step closer to the finish. Perhaps the most intimidating thing about prime Conor McGregor was how effortless everything appeared. He rarely looked rushed. He rarely looked uncomfortable. While opponents were expending enormous amounts of energy trying to close distance or create openings, McGregor seemed to be gliding through the fight. His stance was relaxed. His movements were fluid. His eyes constantly scanned for patterns. It looked almost casual, but behind that relaxed appearance was one of the sharpest striking minds the UFC had ever seen. The psychological element cannot be ignored either. Before many of his biggest fights, McGregor had already started winning battles outside the cage. Press conferences became weapons. Interviews became strategic tools. Every prediction, every insult, every confrontation served a purpose. Some opponents became angry. Others became emotional. Some desperately wanted to prove him wrong. That was exactly what he wanted. Emotional fighters make mistakes. Emotional fighters abandon discipline. And against someone as precise as McGregor, mistakes were often fatal. This combination of confidence, intelligence, power, and psychological warfare transformed him into something the sport had never truly seen before. He wasn't just a champion. He became a global phenomenon. Millions of people who had never watched mixed martial arts suddenly knew his name. Every fight became an event. Every appearance generated headlines. And unlike many athletes who thrive on attention but struggle under pressure, McGregor somehow became even more dangerous when the spotlight was at its brightest. To understand why Conor McGregor became such a dominant force, we need to go back to the beginning and examine the knockouts that built his legend. Because every finish reveals another piece of the puzzle. Every victory shows a different aspect of the system that allowed him to conquer the UFC and become the biggest star the organization had ever produced. His UFC debut against Marcus Brimage immediately revealed something special. Most fighters entering the UFC for the first time appear tense, cautious, and overly respectful of the moment. McGregor looked like he belonged there from the opening second. His stance was wide and relaxed. His hands sat low. He moved constantly in every direction, making himself difficult to predict. More importantly, he began collecting information immediately. Within moments, he identified a recurring habit in Brimage's attacks. Every time Brimage attempted to close distance, he lowered his level and charged forward aggressively. For many fighters, recognizing that pattern would take several minutes. McGregor recognized it almost instantly. Instead of immediately trying to exploit the opening, he began planting ideas. He showed the uppercut. He threatened it. He forced Brimage to think about it. Then, when the opportunity finally arrived, everything unfolded exactly as McGregor envisioned. Brimage reacted to the threat, lowered his head, and walked directly into the trap. The sequence that followed was beautiful. Uppercuts, straight punches, perfect repositioning, and relentless accuracy. It wasn't random violence. It was calculated destruction. By the end of the exchange, Brimage was overwhelmed and McGregor had announced his arrival to the UFC in spectacular fashion. A year later against Diego Brandao, fans witnessed another layer of his brilliance. Brandao was dangerous, explosive, and capable of creating chaotic exchanges where many opponents became uncomfortable. McGregor embraced the chaos. Even when Brandao managed to land shots and force aggressive exchanges, Conor remained composed. He continuously created separation, reset the distance, and guided the fight back into positions where he held the advantage. It was like watching a hunter patiently track prey that had nowhere left to run. The finish itself perfectly demonstrated McGregor's understanding of positioning. Brandao believed he was moving away from danger, but every step carried him deeper into another trap. A perfectly timed right hand disrupted his balance and awareness. Seconds later, the famous left hand arrived. This time it landed cleanly. Brandao crashed to the canvas, and another knockout was added to McGregor's growing collection. The Dustin Poirier fight represented an even bigger test. Poirier was already considered one of the division's most dangerous fighters, and many believed he possessed the skills necessary to challenge McGregor's rise. What followed became one of the clearest examples of why Conor's striking was so difficult to solve. Everyone expected the left hand. Poirier expected the left hand. The entire arena expected the left hand. So McGregor attacked the problem differently. He used double jabs to blind Poirier's vision, closed distance unexpectedly, and created an angle that completely changed the trajectory of the punch. Even though the shot wasn't perfectly clean, the power behind it was enough to send Poirier crashing down. As McGregor's career progressed, these same themes continued appearing over and over again. Against Dennis Siver, it wasn't one spectacular moment that secured victory. It was systematic destruction. McGregor controlled distance beautifully, used his length to maximum effect, and repeatedly punished Siver every time he attempted to close the gap. His footwork made him incredibly difficult to hit. His left hand continued finding openings. His kicks added another layer of complexity. Round after round, Siver was forced to chase a target that seemed impossible to catch. Then came Chad Mendes, perhaps the toughest challenge of his career at that point. Unlike previous opponents, Mendes possessed elite wrestling and explosive athleticism. His objective was simple: drag McGregor into deep waters and expose weaknesses in his grappling. For moments, it looked like the strategy might work. Mendes secured takedowns and controlled portions of the fight. Yet even during adversity, McGregor continued gathering information. He attacked the body relentlessly. He forced Mendes to work. He increased the pace. And when fatigue began affecting both fighters, McGregor struck. The counters became sharper. The pressure intensified. Suddenly the momentum shifted, and another devastating finish followed. Then came the moment that transformed him from superstar into legend. Jose Aldo, a champion many considered untouchable. A fighter who had dominated the featherweight division for years. Yet before the fight even started, McGregor was already attacking from a different angle. He wasn't targeting Aldo's body. He wasn't targeting Aldo's technique. He was targeting Aldo's emotions. Months of psychological warfare gradually created frustration, anger, and impatience. When fight night finally arrived, everything unfolded exactly as McGregor had envisioned. Aldo rushed forward. McGregor anticipated the movement perfectly. One left hand. 13 seconds. The greatest featherweight champion in UFC history was unconscious. The image instantly became one of the most iconic moments in combat sports history. If Aldo represented the peak of psychological warfare, Eddie Alvarez represented the peak of technical brilliance. The performance was almost flawless. Every movement looked sharp. Every reaction looked rehearsed. The combination that dropped Alvarez remains one of the cleanest sequences ever seen in a UFC title fight. 4 punches landed with surgical precision in what felt like the blink of an eye. It wasn't just speed. It was timing. It was preparation. It was understanding exactly where Alvarez would be before he got there. That victory made McGregor the first simultaneous two-division champion in UFC history, a moment that permanently cemented his legacy. Years later, after setbacks and long absences, he returned against Donald Cerrone. Although the fight lasted less than a minute, it offered one final reminder of the creativity that made him special. Shoulder strikes, head kicks, perfectly timed left hands, and relentless pressure combined to produce another highlight reel finish. It would ultimately become the last knockout victory of his UFC career, but it still showcased many of the qualities that had made him great. Looking back at all of these performances, certain patterns become impossible to ignore. His left hand was extraordinary, but it wasn't the whole story. His counter-striking was world-class. His footwork was exceptional. His understanding of timing bordered on genius. His ability to manipulate distance allowed him to hit opponents while remaining just outside their reach. And perhaps most importantly, his psychological warfare often forced opponents into making mistakes before the fight had even truly begun. Of course, even the greatest fighters have weaknesses. McGregor's explosive style demanded enormous energy. His power and speed came at a cost. When fights extended into later rounds, fatigue often became a factor. Fighters like Nate Diaz demonstrated that surviving the early storm could dramatically change the complexion of a fight. Pressure-heavy opponents who refused to be intimidated and continuously pushed forward often created problems that counterstrikers naturally dislike. His grappling also remained a vulnerability. While his takedown defense improved significantly over the years, elite wrestlers and grapplers could still create difficult situations. Chad Mendes, Nate Diaz, and Khabib Nurmagomedov all found success by forcing prolonged grappling exchanges and limiting his ability to dictate range. But none of those weaknesses erase what happened during his prime. For several unforgettable years, Conor McGregor completely changed the sport. He revolutionized promotion. He transformed fighter branding. He elevated the UFC to new levels of popularity. And inside the cage, he delivered performances that continue to be studied by fighters and fans around the world. At his best, Conor McGregor wasn't simply a knockout artist. He was a strategist disguised as a showman, a technician disguised as a superstar, and a master of timing who understood combat at an incredibly high level. That's why his prime remains one of the most fascinating eras in UFC history. And that's why, years after his greatest victories, fans still return to those fights searching for details they may have missed the first time. If you enjoyed this video and want more deep dives into legendary fighters, iconic knockouts, and the hidden details behind some of the greatest careers in MMA history, make sure to subscribe to the channel, leave a like, and tell me in the comments which fighter you want analyzed next. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next video.